Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jessica Bagian from the Department of Education. We're going to go ahead and get started today. Pleased to have all of you on the line and to be able to talk with you about the relief funding that will be released tomorrow and the plans, resources, and tools that are being created to make sure that we all have a strong start to the 2020-2021 school year. So with that, I will go ahead and jump right in. Next slide. We're going to walk through first the programmatic pieces of Strong Start 2020, and then I will pass it to my colleague, Dr. Catherine Posniak, to walk through all of the funding and administrative sides of this plan. Next. At this point in the year, I know many of you have been just working tirelessly for the past month and a half to stand up learning as much as we can and make sure that families are fed and safe. We are beginning now, as much as possible, to pivot and begin planning for next school year, starting as strong and as smooth as it can. And again, that's what we want to talk through with you today. Let's go to the next slide. Perfect. As we talk through those things that we all must accomplish together in order to start next year strong, I just want to start here. You've probably seen this slide about 1,000 times on purpose. At the heart of our plan, the things we seek to achieve with our children have not changed. We want to make sure the children of Louisiana every day are building knowledge, reading meaningful text, expressing their ideas, and solving complex problems. Next slide. And furthermore, we want to make sure that the plans you all have created in order to achieve those objectives also stay constant as much as possible. You all have worked incredibly hard to build one plan and one budget throughout the planning process these past couple of years. And everything we're going to talk about today on this call is intended to augment and build on the foundational plans you have, not create a wholly separate or different plan. We're building on the strong foundation that we all have together. Concretely within that, one huge part of that plan, of course, has been the expansion of high quality curriculum and high quality professional development all across Louisiana. Thanks to your hard work, based on these latest super app allocations, we have 95% of classrooms now using tier 1 high quality equitable curriculum all across Louisiana, which is an incredibly powerful place to be. Of course, the challenge has been over this past 7 weeks, how do we make sure that that curriculum is accessible even if we are all, working in different contexts in our living rooms and our home offices now and for an extended period of time. I do want you to know, I think that strong foundational plan is one that we don't need to veer from. And in fact, I think it is one that in the long haul strengthens Louisiana's response to this pandemic. Because rather than asking our teachers to have to start from scratch or buy materials off of Teachers Pay Teachers or make things up themselves, as I had to do when I taught, we're giving them a foundation to build from. And I want you to know that we are working tirelessly with our curriculum vendors to make sure that they are on the hook for making adjustments so that the curriculum is accessible virtually, so that there's training for teachers virtually, and so that curriculum is accommodating the fact that many students have not received the proper quantity and depth of learning that they normally would have for the end of this current school year. That said, there are some additional pieces to the puzzle that feel increasingly important as we plan for starting 2020, 2021 off strong. And many of these, frankly, are coming from the work you all have outlined. Number one, making sure that as we start next year, we know every child's academic needs. Superintendents, principals, teachers, and parents want this information. and we will be providing free high-quality screeners and diagnostics to help provide this information to everyone involved. Second, we need a plan for every student, especially those with the biggest gaps, including extra time and supports. There are a whole host of pieces to this, but I would highlight two components of these sub-bullets in particular. We're going to have a real focus, especially in those early grades, to make sure that our children continue to learn to read by grade 3. And for all of our students, and even for our educators, there is a need for robust mental health supports, and we will be working hard to support you in those endeavors. Finally, on this slide, I would point you to the last bolded bullet. We've made a lot of traction in Louisiana over the past decade to raise graduation rates, credential rates, and post-secondary enrollment rates. We want to make sure during these crazy times that we don't go the wrong direction on those things. So we want to partner with your school systems to make sure that we are closely tracking our freshmen, sophomores, and juniors, but also that we are really staying close with our seniors who should have walked across the graduation stage, in the next couple of weeks, to make sure that though they've had a really unfortunate and frustrating spring semester of their senior year, we successfully see them off to either college or career, rather than having lost our seniors to opportunity youth of not engaged in society. So a lot of work to do there. Operationally, there are so many things to do, and you all know this, but I would pull out 5 big rocks that we want to work together on. First, if our schools will have buildings closed for any extended period of time, it is not sustainable in the long haul to have children trying to learn through a serious technology gap, which of course affects our poorest children most of all. We need to get to a 1-to-1 device ratio from pre-K all the way to grade 12, and we need internet access for every child that can have it physically in the place that they live, whether that's MiFi or a direct line. For any child that lives in a location for which broadband is not available, we at least need a phone line to be able to regularly communicate with our children. Along those same lines, on the second bullet, we want to work with you to build strategic communications plans. And by that I mean, it is our aspiration that next year, if we are not in person for school, every day, every public school student in Louisiana hears from an educator in the system. Not only so that we can know that they are healthy and safe, but so that we can make sure they continue to be engaged in their learning. I'm sure you all have seen the stories like us nationally and heard anecdotally, even in our own parishes. The sheer quantity of students that are off the grid and not currently in touch with educators is extremely concerning. And it's something we want to get in front of as a state so that we can collectively make sure we're taking care of our youngest citizens and engaging them in their learning. Third, we of course need to make sure that we're able to deliver instruction and professional development virtually, but also related services like teletherapy for speech and teletherapy for counseling. And then finally, these last 2 bullets, a little bit different. On staffing and calendars, we want to make sure that we're planning together. None of us can exactly know, frankly, what next week will look like, but certainly not 3 months from now. And I know we're all together learning so much about pandemics and the effect of this on our economy and our health. But we can prepare for predictable situations, and we want to do that together. So to give you a few examples on staffing, we want to be thinking through ahead of time in the coming months. If in the fall we have to open, but it's not okay for medically fragile or elderly staff members to go back, how will we handle that? If in the fall we have to platoon because of group sizes, how will we handle that? If in the fall we are all operating virtually, do we need to have all teachers delivering the same lesson, or could we have one teacher deliver the lesson, thereby freeing up other teachers to provide feedback and coaching? Similarly, on calendars, not every school system will have the exact same calendar, and we don't expect that. But we can plan ahead of time for, do you want to start early if it's safe? Do you want to extend your day? Do you want to shorten vacations? Do you need additional time with certain kids or all kids? And probably most importantly, it increasingly feels likely that we will end up shifting between these phases of opening that you've probably seen in the White House's plan for reopening America. As we transition between phase 1, phase 2, potentially back to phase 1 and back to phase 2, we as educators are going to have to get very efficient and very good at shifting in all likelihood between in-person and distance learning. And so we want to work on that ahead of time, so that if Governor Edwards has to go on TV and tell us that schools are closing that day or in 2 days, everyone knows what to do. Superintendents, district staff, principals, teachers, children, parents, and the state, so that we can make those transitions quickly in a planned and organized way and get right back to learning, no matter the public health context. We will be providing a whole host of planning supports for these priorities, including one, working with our tier 1 curriculum vendors, as I mentioned before, to make the adjustments we know everyone is going to need. Second, we've already released state negotiated pricing and bulk pricing for devices and Wi-Fi and phones so that you can begin buying those now. Third, we will have free screeners and diagnostics, as I mentioned before. Fourth, we will have a mental health screener for students and educators, and we're working to expand mental health consultation supports for K-12, as we already have in early childhood. Finally, as my colleague Catherine is going to speak to more, we are prioritizing every state dollar we can to support the implementation of these priorities in your systems, so that you have additional funds where you need it for those particularly expensive or unique circumstances that present themselves given the pandemic. So at this time, I'm going to pass it to Catherine. We'll get much more into the detail of the funding and the mechanics here. But I just want to say before I do, I'm so appreciative of the work that you all have been doing all across the state to expand opportunities for kids. We have a lot of work in front of us, but I'm confident that we can achieve it. I'm inspired by what I see you all achieving. And I want you to know that we feel very clear-eyed about the fact that the rocks, the big priority rocks that I just named are certainly not exhaustive. More will be necessary, and we stand ready to support you in whatever way we can. So please consider this the start of a dialogue, and I hope you know that our ears are open and ready, and we're happy to connect out however you need and whenever you need to support a strong start to next year. With that, I will pass it to Catherine to get into more of the details.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Hello, everyone. I think probably most of you on the line have met me before in terms of going to the Business Managers Conference or LASAFAP. But for those of you who don't know me, I lead our fiscal operations and federal support team. And so I have been involved in this project, both from the money side and the federal program side. So what I'm going to walk you through now is the application that is going to support the plan and the priorities that Jessica just walked through. I'm going to get pretty in the weeds on some of this funding stuff. I know that this is going to feel, there are going to be some parts of this that are going to feel familiar and akin to Super App. And parts of this that are going to not be that way. Typically with Super App, we're not having to sort of give you a briefing on, your standard funding in it, like Title I or IDA, because we do that at throughout the year at your conferences. But in this case, we are introducing a new type of funding to you, and we're all learning what that means within the context of, a multi-trillion-dollar relief package. And so I'll get into that, and then I will wrap it up at the end in getting trying to tie both the relief funding that you are working with and those sort of key priorities that districts will need to pay attention to in order to start strong for the next school year. So this money that we are talking about today comes from the CARES Act, which was signed into law on March the 27th. This, again, was a multi-trillion-dollar relief package that included lots of things in it, including money specifically for education. That's an important thing to talk about. Obviously, it's important that there's education money in it, but I share this, the idea that this law actually was addressing many things happening because of the pandemic, in that this happened very quickly, right? And there was a lot packed in here. And that's to say, unlike other education-specific laws that take months and years, multiple years, sometimes a decade, right, to put together, such as ESSA, this happened in a matter of weeks, which means that there wasn't the level of detail. In some cases, there are discrepancies, right, as different revisions and edits were made. And that means that there are a number still of unanswered questions that we have about sort of the finer details of this. So what we know for certain is that there is money out there, that it's going to LEAs. We have allowable uses, but as you all know, the devil's in the details, right, on this stuff. And so that's what to say, Ed released this money to states and allocated it last Thursday. We immediately submitted our application for that funding. We have gotten this money in G5. So that's all been great. And we can, begin to draw down those funds and allocate those funds to you. But Ed has not provided any additional guidance since their release last Thursday. And that includes on things like Equitable Services. So I'm going to share with you today what we know and what we can move forward with, but also want to make sure and be transparent about the fact that there will be more guidance forthcoming as we get more information from Ed. So, CARES Act education funding. So actually, if you can go back to the former slide, please. There are two pots of money in the CARES Act that are specifically targeted to K-12 education. The first one is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, and that is here referred to as ESSERF, or ESSER if you take the F off for the fund. And that's the primary source of funding for K-12. And that comes into two parts. So the first part of ESSER are the formula funds, and that's the funding that we're going to allocate to you all tomorrow. And it sounds like someone might be off of mute, so if you can put yourself on mute, we'd appreciate it. And so the ESSER formula funds, and actually, there we go. The ESSER formula funds are, so we received the state allocation. 90% of that state allocation will go to LEAs. And how it's determined how that funding will go to LEAs will be through the Title I Part A formula. And I want to be clear here that the Title I Part A part is simply the mechanism by which they decided to get the money out to LEAs. It is not actually, this is not an extension of the Title I program. You are not going to do rank and serve. You're not going to, decide what you're going to take at the district level and what you're going to flow out to schools, and it's not going to be part of their school-wide program. Nothing else about Title I is applicable here. They're just using the formula. It was convenient, and they didn't have to come up with a special formula for this grant because the CARES Act in general, they wanted to target it to students and families that needed it the most. And since Title I is already oriented toward students in low-income households, that was a formula that they decided to use. So how we determine then what part of the funding of that 90% of the state allocation your LEA will receive will be based on the proportional share of the state's 1920 Title I Part A allocation. In other words, if Louisiana got $100 million for Title I Part A last year that went to LEAs, and your district got 3% of that Title I Part A allocation, you are going to get 3% of the 90% designated for LEAs. So that is the determination for any LEA that received Title I Part A. You will be receiving funds from ESSER. So that is money that we will give you tomorrow, and I'm going to talk more about what exactly you have to do with those funds. There are also funds at the state level that we would goes to the SEA, so that's us at the Department of Education. We are using that funding, and that funding is designated to provide additional supports and response to this pandemic. We are using those funds for two purposes that Jessica had laid out previously. In part, to provide resources, global resources that all LEAs can use. And then two, most of the funding will be used to provide additional incentive grants that can help support those Start Strong 2020 planning priorities. And we'll talk, this will be very similar to what you all have experienced in Super App, although simplified, right? So school systems that agree to implement each of the priorities, and we'll walk through them later on in this deck, will be eligible to receive those will be eligible to receive incentive funds. As in Super App, in the Start Strong 2020 application, school systems will have opportunities to make funding requests against some of those priorities. So if you basically, it will be a series of, there are 15 priorities, a yes, no of whether or not the LEA agrees to implement those priorities. And then some of those priorities that we do know are going to require additional funds or support. We will be asking you, if you agree to that priority, we will be asking you what additional funds will you need, and we will provide guidance on what those costs could be in the guidance that will support these priorities. So that's all the big pot of ESSER funds. I also wanted to mention, because you're going to see it in the application tomorrow, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. So in the CARES Act, there was some money designated for state governors to use toward education. So in Louisiana, Governor Edwards received $50 million that he gets to determine how to use that to serve education in the state. He has not made an announcement or decided how those funds will be used. He can designate them in part or in whole to LEAs, to higher ed, or to other educational entities. To the extent to which those are designated to any of those funds are made available to LEAs, that will also be embedded in this application, in part because of the reporting requirements. That's purely for administrative purposes, so that because there are equitable share requirements and other financial reporting requirements that, as you all who are familiar with EGMS know, all get tied in there. It didn't really make sense for the governor's office to try to administer these funds separately. That would create, actually, we realized as we were trying to support them in that, that would create actually a lot of burden on LEAs for a lot of reasons. So that will eventually be baked in here. Right now, there's just a placeholder in the application, but I did want to flag that for you all about why that was there, because that administration will happen eventually. So if we can move to the next slide. So for the formula funds that you are receiving, and to be clear, I think that there is the funds, you are receiving 100% of your allocation tomorrow. So this isn't like Title I, where we give you 90% and then we come back and we make you whole with the last 10% once we take student counts. We know what your student count is. We know how much money that you receive, or what percentage you received of the 1920 Title I allocation. So you're going to get your full formula allocation tomorrow loaded into the EGMS application. And so the CARES Act outlines 12 uses for ESSERF funds in there, and the 12 activities, or the 12 uses, are listed here. And as you can see, they're quite broad, because number one is activities authorized by ESEA, IDA, Perkins, McKenty-Vento, also the Adult and Literacy Act, and a couple of others. And so basically, any allowable activity under those programs are also an allowable expense under these funds. And then what you see flowing through from there in these subsequent bullets are additional designations or uses of these funds that we're trying to specifically address some of the concerns that are related to the pandemic. So you see here, preparedness and response efforts. These funds can be used to address school needs, focusing on certain subgroups that may have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, et cetera. And so you can see these all here. What I would say about these uses, again, they're very broad. There's actually a lot of overlap in here as well, right? And so you can have an expense and it could be allowed for in a number of these bullets. So for those of you who are familiar with EGMS, when it comes, I'm going to talk a little bit about coding because these are so broad and there is so much overlap. Our EICs, which is again how we code expenses, will be a little bit different, won't completely align to this list, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, I wanted to just provide some additional guidance on allowability. If you can flip the slide. So as you would with any application, there are assurances. These are taken directly from the federal law here. You will need to sign off on these assurances before the application will be available for you tomorrow. And I wanted to point out two of those assurances and make sure that you are aware of. So we just talked about all of the different allowable uses of these funds. The CARES Act made particular note of the first bullet that what is not going to be an allowable use of ESSER funds is subsidizing or offsetting executive salaries or benefits of individuals who are not employees of the LEA. And two, expenditures related to state or local teacher or faculty unions or associations. So they did make a point of drawing that out, and I did want to put that here because, I think you could take away from the previous slide that basically you could spend this money on anything. And there are a few things that they did call out specifically that they were not going to permit. I also wanted to talk about the second provision because I know that some of you have had some outreach on it. And this is, again, directly verbatim the assurance. And it says here that the LEA will, to the greatest extent practicable, continue to compensate its employees and contractors during the period of any disruptions or closures related to COVID-19. And I should have underlined or bolded here, to the greatest extent practicable. So this allows you to pay contractors. I know that this has been there's been a lot of conversation around this, right, of being able to continue to pay here. This law is trying to encourage you all to do that to the extent that it makes sense, but you are not required to do so. So I got a couple of emails when this first got passed of, contractors saying you have to pay me, the law says that you do. What the law does is strongly encourage you to do that to the extent to which you can, but it does not require you to do so. We can move to the next slide. I also wanted to draw out this additional reporting assurance in central data. So this was a lot of money that Congress passed. There is already a lot of scrutiny on it. And so we have already been put on notice about the various reporting requirements that may be coming our way. And so we wanted to give you a heads up here that, again, even though that there are broad uses for these funds, that there is particular interest around some of those uses, particularly the ones that are around addressing the digital divide, securing devices and connectivity for students, and also supporting remote learning. And so in response to that, when we designed this application, as opposed to just giving you 12 EICs that lined up to the allowable uses that were in the law, we try to make them more specific and responsive to the reporting requirements that we've already gotten a heads up on. And so in the planning guide, which was linked to you, it's not in there yet, but will be in the next day, if not 2 days, the unique set of EICs that will help you with reporting that will hopefully provide a little bit more clarity than the allowable uses, which again had a ton of overlap in them. You can flip to the next slide. So Equitable Services. So here we cite the law here, section 18005 does state that an LEA receiving funds under this act or under this provision shall provide equitable services. And as provided under section 1117 of ESEA, which is the Title I Equitable Services provision. Right now, we don't know much more than that. Again, Ed actually specifically noticed us that they are going to provide guidance, separate and specific guidance to Equitable Services, but we have not seen it yet. And so because this is the case, there are two things I want to note here. One, in anticipation of this guidance, and I know that there will be a lot of interest for those of you all who have Equitable Services obligations. We have already scheduled to have a webinar next Thursday, May 7th at 11 a.m. The link is here to provide you the information we hope to have at that time about what this needs to look like and what consultation needs to look like. In the meantime, we have not, there's basically a part of the EGMS application that is set up for Equitable Services that is not turned on. So you're going to get your allocation tomorrow, but there is not going to be an Equitable Services calculation for you to do because we have not received this guidance from Ed. If you are wanting to estimate what the equitable share is going to be based on what is provided in the law and after we have consulted with our legal counsel, we believe that the best gauge for this, what this will end up being, is the same percentage that you all determined in targeting step 4 in your 2019-2020 super app. Whatever that percentage is, if it's 5%, if it's 10%, if it's 2%, that percentage will apply to your formula allocation. So if your Title I equitable share percentage was again 5%, then 5% of your ESSER allocation will be designated for providing equitable services. I hope that we will be able to finalize and confirm that calculation for you, but we didn't want to hold back. We know that you all have a lot of other expenses and things like that that you all already need to budget. But if you're wanting to sort of get an idea of how much do you need to sort of set aside for equitable services, you should take a look at targeting step 4, and it will be the 1920 data that you are looking at, not the newly approved 2020-2021 application. This grant is happening for the 1920 school year because in part, this is a relief grant. That's what the R stands for in the CARES Act, is in part to provide relief for the effects of the pandemic that occurred in the school year. So we will have more information to you on equitable services. You'll see more of that guidance built out as we go along. Next, I wanted to highlight for you a requirement that some of you all may have seen before, but I thought it was worth explaining because they've recently sort of started to emphasize the importance of this for GEPA section 427. And that requires, and this is going to be under the administration tab of the application. And you can see exactly what it will say. It's going to ask you to describe in 1 to 2 paragraphs how the LEA, when using these grant funds specifically, will ensure that students, teachers, and other beneficiaries with special needs will have equitable access to and participation in grant-funded activities. And by special needs, we mean that they may face particular barriers that can impede that equal access and participation because of things like gender, race, color, national origin, disability, and age. Also included in these instructions is this note: this is not where you cut and paste your non-discriminatory hiring policy. That is not what they are looking for here. They are looking for you to specifically describe how you're going to make sure with this particular grant, how you are how are you helping to make sure that there are not barriers to participation. Let me give you an example. If you can flip to the next slide. If you can flip to the next slide, please. Oh, there we go. So this is an example. It's an abbreviated example. Clearly, this isn't 3 pages long, but I wanted to give you an example of what it means to specifically address the grant. So this is an example from SRSA, which are REAP funding for Title V schools, rural schools. And you see the instructions here that are very similar, right? How can you ensure when using these SRSA grant funds that there are no barriers to equitable access? And you can see the sample response here, which is, we will use SRSA grant funds to purchase computers and laptops as part of our school-wide technology upgrade. Because a significant portion of our students are from families where Spanish is the primary language spoken at home, we will provide user instructions for the computers, both in Spanish and English. So as you can see here, this is specific to the grant because they're actually using these grant funds for the technology upgrade. The solution or the remedy is specific to the grant because it's about the instructions that they will have for computers. And it's specific to the context of this district where they have a significant Spanish-speaking population. This response is not going to make sense for some of you out there and your LEAs, right? Because you do not have a significant portion of your students who are Spanish speakers, but that is the case here. So that is what they are looking for. Now, this does not have to be every single budget item or activity. I think, you know, I think particularly with the alignment to the strong application, I think you are going to be able to more broadly address how is it in your plans, right? In your Strong Start plans, how are you ensuring that you are providing access to and that to populations that may otherwise have barriers to their participation? So I think, again, you have the opportunity here to speak broadly to those plans and the activities that you are implementing there, and you don't necessarily need to take it for every single activity to provide an explanation. We don't give you that much room in the application anyway, so you'll keep it to a couple of paragraphs. All right. If you can now we're going to dive into the planning priorities. And so we just talked about the funding, and then all of this lives in the planning guide. Again, it was linked in the chat box if you want to copy and paste that link into your browser. Right now, this is the 1.0 version, with the 2.0 version coming with more fiscal guidance shortly in a couple of days. But we wanted to get out to you what we have. But this planning guide includes both, again, the priorities and the supports that we are providing around response and recovery, in addition to the information about the education funding that is available through the CARES Act. So to take a deep dive into the planning priorities that Jessica described more broadly at the beginning of this call, those planning priorities, again, are designed to support school systems as they plan for the upcoming school year, and are not designed to be a plan unto themselves. They are designed to augment the plans that you already have in Super App that have already been approved last week, and to make sure that they are responsive to this current, the current situation. And together, what they do is they focus actions and supports on three things. One, addressing unfinished learning that happened from this spring. Two, setting the foundation for continuous learning in 2020, 2021, and preparing for what we think will be inevitable sort of toggling back and forth between school facility closures and some configuration of modified operations. You know, we all hope that that doesn't happen and doesn't come to fruition, but we need to be prepared for when that might be the case. So as we set these priorities up, again, because they are meant to augment the plans that you all already have in place, we organize them by the domains that you are familiar with, right? Core academics, students with diverse needs, workforce talent, and LEA systems. And they look very similar to what you would have in the framework. So the school system planning framework you see the priorities, you see any funding guidance that we have there for you. Where there are applications, there are a handful in this application, and then the resources that we are providing to you to give you some guidance on these items. So I'm going to briefly walk through each of the domains to give you the highlights on the priorities that are part of each of these domains. So this is core academics, and the things that the priorities, the planning priorities that are associated with Start Strong 2020 are addressing individual student needs, right? And so starting off with, you know, making sure that every kid has a screener in diagnostic in ELA and math at the beginning of the year, whenever that is, and that learning plans are developed for those students that it's determined have the greatest or most significant amount of unfinished learning. This is where the planning for continuous use of or continuous education happens, right? So, you know, whether a kid is in a classroom or in their living room, how can we make sure that they are getting the instruction that they need to? And that's for both the core subjects and non-core subjects as well. And then making sure that high school students continue to be on track for graduation, and that our graduates who, you know, cross that virtual stage this spring have successful transitions. And then I'll just pause here. Actually, if you can go back to that slide, just to look at the layout, right, of what you see here in terms of the priority. So you see the priority in the far left. You see the funding guidance. In some cases, we're saying we're going to provide this resource to you for free. So we're actually going to provide the diagnostics to you. You all should not have to purchase something separately. Our assessment team has been working to make sure that we have a diagnostics in place that are specifically responsive to the situation. In other cases, we're going to tell you, hey, actually, you could request additional incentive funds for this. Where that is true, we tell you here what application questions should you anticipate, and then the resources. I will note on the resources, we're moving very quickly. We wanted to get this money out to you. The bulk of these resources will be available next week. Some of them will be a little bit longer, particularly resources that have to do with about the reopening of schools, because we're still waiting for guidance from the Department of Health, et cetera. And so, you know, this is, again, a little bit different than what you would typically see us roll out, in that the context is changing. We're learning new information all the time. These resources will continue to evolve as we go along. You can move to the next slide. So this is the students with diverse needs domain, and this focuses on first ensuring student and staff well-being. This is where we talk about the social, emotional, and mental health supports the supports that we're providing for specific subgroups, including English language learners and students with disabilities. I did want to point out here in for students with diverse needs, we actually have two priorities for students with disabilities. One, to ensure that the first row, which is the third row here, addresses students with disabilities and making sure that they're going to receive instruction and related services and have appropriate access to devices. We pulled out compensatory education separately from that. We know that this is a major area of concern, and also we anticipate that this will be an area where we need to provide additional support. So I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that this is one place in the funding guidance where we say, we're going to come back to you on this. So we know that you're not going to be ready to tell us in the next month what your needs are for compensatory education, in part because you are not likely to have the opportunity to assess your students. So what we are going to do here is set aside an amount. We want to better understand what the needs are as you all do those compensatory education reviews of your students. And we will come back to you all likely later this summer or early fall about what the opportunity there is and how we potentially could help support some of those additional compensatory education costs. The third domain is workforce talent, and this is addressing the things like, like we are with students, right? Like how can we make sure that their core and non-core subjects continue regardless of whether or not they're in classrooms or at home. Same thing with professional development plans for districts, right? So some of you already have those in place. Whatever your professional development plan is, how do you ensure that teachers continue to receive that professional development, whether teachers are able to be in their classrooms or have to be at home over the course of the next 6 to 18 months. Making sure that mentor and content leader training continues. And then there is this piece about the adaptive staffing plans. So as schools toggle back and forth between, school facilities and home, how is it that they are thinking about the configuration of their staffing models in different ways? And this is one of those areas where we are offering districts additional support for partners that can help them think through those plans. And then finally, LEA systems. And so this is where we get into the district level sort of procedures and issues that protocols that need to be put into place, such as what is the plan to reopen facilities? What do those calendars and schedules look like through the year that can maximize learning opportunities? What is the communications plan in the event, again, that you can't take attendance every morning with students at desks? Achieving a 1-to-1 device ratio and internet connectivity, and where internet isn't available, making sure that students have access to a phone line. And then finally, making sure that, at minimum, we're able to sustain the number of early childhood seats that we have in our state, knowing that the need is going to grow even more as a result of the pandemic. And I just want to take a pause here to again, go back to this layout. What you see again in that left-hand column where you see those school system priorities, these are effectively assurances. And we know that you don't know, and you're not going to be in a position to say, here's my plan, I can upload this right now. We know that this is something that is going to have to be done over time as that guidance is available. But what we are asking for in the application is a commitment to do those things, again, knowing that the timing of that will be contingent on a number of factors, including being able to secure partners and additional support to accomplish those things. So what this will look like in the application is a series of yes, no's. Where there is a funding opportunity, when you check yes, it will open up and ask you the question so that it can collect that information from you. I also wanted to note here on the 1-to-1 student device ratio, on all of these, right? And it seems like we're getting some questions about how do I know how much I can ask for? This guidance will live in the resources that you see to the right. We have already released the guidance on technology for continuous learning. We will hopefully be providing you in the next week guidance about what is the support or where can we meet you on being able to achieve that one-to-one student device ratio. So we are looking at the data we recently collected from you all about the need, and we'll be able to be clearer with you all about like where there's an opportunity to get additional funds and where is it that the district will need to prioritize its funds towards some of those student devices and connectivity devices as well. So that was a lot. Thank you for being patient with me as I go through that. Again, in the guide, that those priorities are available. And so that's there for you if you want to take a closer look and read through those. Just to talk about what the timeline is for the next 6 to 8 weeks. So we're releasing the planning guide today. Again, this is the 1.0 version. We still have funding guidance to put in there. And so, on all of our guides and guidance, we'll be stamping those with dates. So just to make sure that you have the most recent date on all of these. That is just going to be the reality of a lot of the resources and guidance that we provide. They will be evolving. The webinar is happening right now. It is being recorded and we will post that later today along with the deck. We will tomorrow open both the application and upload the formula allocation for you all. And so again, standard procedure, we will open up central data. You will fill in contacts that are required for the application. You will sign off on a series of assurances, and that will give you access to the application. I ask that you be patient with us. We have a lot of people working virtually. And so earlier this week, some of you all may have experienced with Super App, there was a little bit of a delay. And so we rebooted the system. Hopefully we won't have that happen again. But please know we are working as hard as possible to move this stuff into production for you and to give you access. So once we get that application open, we'll get those allocations loaded for you all as well. I want to note here, and I actually realize now I should have had a slide on this, the date of availability for these funds is officially going to say May 1 because that's when we're allocating them to you. But you are going to be able to have pre-award costs back to March the 13th. So technically on your GAN, what it's going to say is May 1, but there is going to be a provision on the GAN that makes it clear that pre-award costs to March 13th will be allowable. And as with the, the consolidated applications, once you submit your application, you will receive substantial approval to that May 1st date. The Equitable Services webinar, again, linked here, will happen next Thursday, provided that, we are receiving guidance on this up and through next Wednesday. If we don't end up receiving guidance, we'll reschedule this, but we thought it was better for us to put something on the calendar now and hope for the best. By next Friday, the resources that are supporting all of these priority areas will be available. Some of them are available now and you'll be able to click on those links. A few others we're still trying to confirm some information on. And again, those will become available throughout next week and by next Friday, with the exception probably of the school facilities reopening guidance. We are going to be waiting for information from the state on that. May 29th is going to be the deadline for you to submit the application if you want to be eligible for incentive funds, because that's funding that we would have to get board approval for. So if you are interested in that, you'll want to make sure that you're able to get those applications submitted by May the 29th. for Bessie to approve at its June 17th meeting. And then once those grants are approved, we will upload those to EGMS as quickly as possible for you by the end of that week. And this note down here is just underscoring what I've already said about the guidance and such that we are providing in all of the resources. Please check the date. And we're going to be putting out a whole new section of our website on this as well. And so you'll want to bookmark that and just make sure that you're grabbing the most recent guidance that we have available. Here's where you'll be able to find additional support and resources. I realize that as much information as we've thrown at you all today, but I'm sure that you have many unanswered questions yet. You're part of the club, and trust me, I still have many unanswered questions as well as we wait for more details from Ed, but we're certainly going to get you all of the information that we have as soon as we have it. As I mentioned before, there is going to be a new section of our website at Louisiana Believes that's dedicated to Strong Start 2020. That will be up available next Friday. We will keep you all informed in the weekly newsletters. We will continue to have the school system planning and superintendent's calls and provide briefings there. Your network teams are the best resources for you if you have issues that are specific to your school system and your context. And then finally, a little bit of a pivot. So we've had the COVID-19 email address for you all to answer all of your COVID-related questions. With this application, you know, we're making a pivot to preparation and planning for the upcoming year. And just as you would with Super App, you should reach out to the Grants Help Desk about any questions that you have related to this Strong Start 2020 application. We just ask that you include that Strong Start 2020 in the subject line. Please know that the team is in overdrive right now trying to get the application and the allocations together so that those all can be released tomorrow. So if you do have questions today, just know that there may be a delay, and if it wasn't available in this deck, I think it could be likely that we don't have the answer yet, but we will track those questions that are open and try to address those in FAQs as we get those responses. Right, we will pause there. And I'm going to take a quick look at the questions. Jessica, I don't know if you've been able to see any questions that you have, but I'm going to need a moment to just take a look through and see what questions we can address, or I can address. So there's a question about what is the dollar amount per student that will be populated for each LEA, so that the LEA can ensure that its allocation amount is correct. This is not being allocated on a per pupil level, on a per pupil amount. This is, again, the proportional share of the Title I Part A allocation. So if you take a look at all of the GANs that we have posted publicly on EGMS, and you can see what the total is there and what the district share is, that's the share of these funds that you're going to receive. The reason why it doesn't end up being a per pupil amount is because Title I isn't designed, that formula isn't designed to be a per pupil amount. There are many factors there that get weighted to include hold harmless amounts and things like that that are baked in. And there's a lot of historical data in there that ends up staying with the district. So it is not a flat per pupil amount in there. It is the proportional share of your district's share of the Title I Part A allocation. But I can assure you, those numbers have been scrubbed many times and double checked. So we're confident that we're going to get you the right allocation tomorrow. I already answered the question about the expenditure of the funds. There is a question here. Do you suspect that this grant will cover services such as hired medical personnel for the purpose of screening students and employees upon entering the school daily? Yes, there is one of those 12 allowable expenses that talk about preparedness and response and coordination. And so, you know, if this is about schools returning and also training and such that goes along with sanitation, that costs there that are related to that would be allowable. And then there's a question about whether or not expenditures for non-instructional costs for running the district during shutdown, for example, feeding students and, you know, paying contractors, et cetera. And yes, there are provisions in here for, again, response efforts, which is in large part why there is a pre-award cost availability date of March 13th, because there was recognition that, yes, school districts did incur costs of just trying to keep their districts operational and running through that time, and that would include costs like that. I do also, this came up earlier on the call, this morning on the superintendent's call. These funds are specifically designated for LEA. So, you know, we use the term school systems in many ways, but in the law, this provides for local education agencies. And so you must be an LEA and you must have been a recipient of Title I Part A funding in the 1920 school year if your school system is going to receive funds from the ESSER grant. And that is written into the law. So if you do not have a super app, if you do not receive Title I Part A funding, you are not an eligible entity, or your school system is not an eligible entity for these ESSER funds. And then the reimbursement process will work the same as it does for any of our grants. So once you have an approved budget and your application is good to go, then you will see that that will open up the link where you can start to begin to submit your expenses for reimbursement in EGMS. All right, so I think some of these other questions we've either covered or they are specific to some district contacts. We will collect these and address them in the FAQs if we don't think that they are provided for in the planning guidance that, again, we will be updating soon for you all. In the meantime, if you can take a look at the guide, again, we'll post this deck. As we learned, I wouldn't be surprised if we scheduled another webinar. So if you have questions, you know, please send them. If we feel like we can't get the answers, we'll collect them. And it may be that we need to do another funding webinar in the next week or in the next couple of weeks to catch up and provide you all with these additional questions. So with that, we will close out. Thank you all so much. We appreciate you.